Judge William Harrison adjusted his black robes with practiced precision, the fabric settling neatly over his shoulders as he prepared for another Monday morning in courtroom 12 of the Manhattan Municipal Court. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual chaos, but inside the courthouse, a heavy stillness prevailed. At 62, Harrison was a man of routine. His graying temples and sharp blue eyes conveyed an air of authority that rarely faltered. For over 2 decades, he had presided over cases ranging from mundane traffic violations to contentious civil disputes. His reputation as a no-nonsense judge was well known, and he prided himself on efficiency and fairness, or so he believed. Yet, as he reviewed the day's docket, Harrison felt a distinct unease. The argument with his daughter Sarah over the weekend still echoed in his mind. "She's leaving medical school for fashion?" he had exclaimed to his wife Martha the previous evening, his tone laced with disbelief. "All those years of preparation gone." "She's finding her own path, William," Martha had replied, her voice calm but firm. "She's not a child anymore." Harrison had dismissed the conversation with a shake of his head, unwilling to acknowledge his disappointment. The topic lingered as he sat at his desk, flipping through case files. Today's docket appeared routine: a handful of traffic infractions, a parking violation, and a minor property dispute. James, his longtime clerk, entered quietly, placing a neat stack of papers on the desk. "Morning, Your Honor," he said, glancing at Harrison's furrowed brow. "Morning, James," Harrison replied curtly. The bailiff called the court to order promptly at 9 a.m., and the first few cases proceeded smoothly. Harrison dispensed justice with his usual efficiency, his rulings concise and direct. Case number 2374, City of Manhattan v. Williams, parking violation, the bailiff announced. A young woman approached the podium, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She was poised and professional, dressed in a navy pantsuit, her natural hair styled neatly. Carrying a leather briefcase, she exuded confidence. Harrison glanced at her briefly. "You're here for parking in a loading zone on Fifth Avenue?" he asked, his tone brisk. "Actually, Your Honor," the woman began, her voice steady, "I'm representing Ms. Williams." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" "Sandra Thompson, Your Honor, from Mitchell & Associates," she replied, opening her briefcase and removing a file. Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line. "Bringing an attorney for a parking violation seems excessive," he remarked. Sandra met his gaze evenly. "My client values her time, as do I," she said simply. The tension in the room was palpable as Sandra began presenting her case. The courtroom, with its wood-paneled walls and high ceilings, seemed to close in around them. "On March 15th, my client was ticketed for parking in a loading zone. However, the signage in the area was obscured by scaffolding due to ongoing construction. We have time-stamped photographs and witness statements that support this claim," Sandra continued, holding up an image of the partially hidden sign. Harrison's jaw tightened. "Miss Thompson, are you suggesting your client isn't responsible for understanding basic parking rules just because a sign was allegedly obscured?" Sandra's expression remained calm. "With all due respect, Your Honor, Municipal Code Section 4.23 states that clear visibility of signs is required for enforcement. In addition, the case of Torres v. City of Manhattan, 2019, supports this argument." "I'm well aware of the code, Miss Thompson," Harrison interrupted, his voice sharp. "I've been on this bench longer than you've likely been practicing law." Sandra didn't flinch. "Then you know that precedent is on our side." The gallery murmured, sensing the growing tension. Harrison's gaze shifted back to Sandra, who was standing with an air of unwavering confidence. There was something familiar about her. The way she moved, the tilt of her head, even the subtle way she spoke. It felt as if he'd seen her before. Then his eyes caught the glint of a silver locket at Sandra's neck. It shone brightly in the sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows, momentarily distracting him. The sight stirred a vague recognition that he couldn't place. Harrison turned his attention back to the case, but the locket refused to leave his mind. His gaze flicked between Sandra and the document in front of him, trying to make sense of the connection he felt. The locket, the tilt of her head, the voice, it all tugged at a buried memory, but he couldn't name it. Your Honor, Sandra said, snapping him out of his thoughts. I have the testimonies of the construction workers who witnessed the obscured sign and can corroborate my client's claim. Harrison cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. Submit the testimonies, Miss Thompson. I will review them in detail. The court will take a brief recess to allow time for review. The bailiff announced a 15-minute recess, and the courtroom stirred to life as people stood, stretched, and murmured among themselves. Sandra gathered her documents, glancing at Harrison with a look of subtle concern. He caught the briefest flash of recognition in her eyes before she turned and walked toward the court's exit. Harrison's mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He watched as Sandra left, his eyes lingering on the silver locket. The memory pushed at him, a feeling that was just out of reach, yet insistent. In the privacy of his chambers, Harrison sat alone at his desk, the files from the case spread in front of him. The photograph Sandra had shown him seemed to shift under his gaze. He placed his hands on the desk and leaned forward, his mind racing. Why does that locket seem so familiar? He muttered to himself, running a hand over his face. His eyes fell on the framed photo of Sarah on his desk, taken on a family vacation years ago. She was smiling, her arms around both him and Martha. Suddenly, it hit him. The locket, the confident smile, the way Sandra carried herself, it all matched Sarah's features. Sarah's sister, he whispered, feeling a pang of guilt. Harrison picked up the phone and dialed Martha. She answered after the second ring, her voice steady. William, what is it? Martha, I need to ask you something. Has Sarah ever mentioned a sister? There was a pause, then a sigh. She did once, years ago, but she never found her. We thought she'd given up. Sandra Thompson, Harrison said, his voice tight. I'm certain of it now. They're sisters. There was silence on the other end. This changes everything, William. Harrison leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had unknowingly passed judgment on Sarah's sister, someone who was more connected to him than he could have imagined. The realization left him reeling. When the court reconvened, Harrison stood with an air of resolve. He cleared his throat, the weight of his newfound knowledge heavy on his conscience. Miss Thompson, after further review, I am dismissing the parking violation, Harrison announced, his voice calmer and more controlled than before. Sandra's eyes widened in surprise. Thank you, Your Honor. Harrison's eyes met Sandra's, and for a brief moment, he saw her guard drop. There was a flicker of relief, but it was quickly replaced with professionalism. He allowed himself to consider the strange comfort of seeing her stand tall, poised in the face of adversity. As Sandra left the podium, Harrison watched her, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. She sensed something was different, but before she could react, the next case was called, pulling the courtroom's focus back to routine matters. That evening, Harrison and Sarah sat in the quiet of his chambers. The city's noise outside the courthouse windows felt distant and irrelevant. Sarah, Harrison began, his voice softer than usual, I need to talk to you about something important. She looked at him, her expression guarded. What is it, Dad? He hesitated, searching for the right words. There was a case today, a woman named Sandra Thompson. She's your sister, isn't she? Her eyes widened with a mix of shock and disbelief. How did you know? I saw her in court today. The resemblance, the locket. His voice caught in his throat. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't speak. Harrison reached for her hand, his own trembling. I want to make this right. I need to meet her. Sarah nodded, a mixture of relief and trepidation crossing her features. The next day, Sarah, Harrison, and Sandra met at a small cafe. The air was filled with tension as they exchanged greetings. Sandra, although outwardly composed, couldn't hide the flicker of nervousness in her eyes. I can't believe this is happening, Sandra said, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither can I, Harrison admitted, his own emotions raw. The conversation began with small talk, but soon turned to shared memories. Sarah spoke of her life growing up, the things she loved, and the reason she pursued medicine initially. Sandra shared stories of her adoptive parents and her search for her biological family. Harrison sat back, listening as his daughters found common ground, their bond forming in front of him. He realized that, despite his past mistakes, this moment was a second chance. Over the next few weeks, Harrison shifted his approach. In the courtroom, he became more open-minded, listening carefully to both sides of every case. His staff noticed the difference, but no one dared question it. Sandra and Sarah spent more time together, sharing memories and learning about each other's lives. Harrison watched from afar, his heart swelling with both pride and regret. He knew he needed to apologize for his past decisions, not just to Sarah, but to Sandra as well. One evening, as Sandra and Sarah sat at the kitchen table, Harrison approached. "I need to say this to both of you," he started, voice low. "I let my biases get in the way of being the father you both deserved. I'm sorry." Sandra's eyes softened, and Sarah squeezed her sister's hand. "We're past that now," Sandra said, her voice filled with newfound hope. "We're here now." The family began to heal, learning to navigate their new dynamic. Harrison took Sandra to work with him at the courthouse, showing her the importance of reform and how he planned to incorporate changes in the court system to better serve the community. They all celebrated holidays together, with laughter and warmth filling their home. Sandra and Sarah became inseparable, their bond deepening with each shared experience. Harrison found joy in watching them flourish, knowing he had helped bring them together. Months passed, and the changes in Harrison's courtroom became evident. He introduced programs that encouraged understanding and community support over strict punishment. Sandra helped implement these changes, using her experience to guide defendants toward solutions rather than fines. At a gathering to honor Sandra for her work, Harrison stood at the podium. "This journey has taught me that justice is not just about rules and regulations. It's about understanding the people behind them. Sometimes, justice starts at home." The room erupted in applause as Sandra and Sarah beamed at him. The silver locket still hung around Sandra's neck, a reminder of how far they had come. The Harrison family, once fractured, now stood together, a testament to redemption, understanding, and the power of second chances.